Let me tell you a story. It's about Chael Sonnen. Now, you all know who he is, but do you know how he got to be the biggest draw and the industry's highest paid athlete of all time? Do you know how he defeated every champion from every organization the sport of mixed martial arts has ever seen? Do you know how he got to be the undefeated and undisputed people's champion? If you don't, you will know when I'm finished. Now listen up, because I'm only going to tell you once. Chael Sonnen's career fascinates me on so many different levels, but his story begins long before his fight at UFC 117 back in 2010 against Anderson Silva for the UFC middleweight championship. His story actually begins in the early 2000s. In the late 90s, Chael Sonnen was fighting as an amateur. Now, in 2018, amateur MMA, for the most part, is still the Wild Wild West. And it does have similarities to what it was like to fight amateur in the 90s. But basically, what it was like to fight as an amateur in the 90s is the only thing that was different between being considered a pro fighter and being considered an amateur fighter is the pro fighters got paid and the amateur guys didn't. So even though he's still competing in college wrestling at the University of Oregon, he has started his MMA career. So if you look at his record, depending on which one you look at, has fights from the late 90s on it, even though he was still at the University of Oregon wrestling. His MMA career as a pro doesn't actually begin until 2002. So at this point in time, he's training at Team Quest, and at Team Quest, there's two tiers of fighters. There's Tier 1, which is the established guys like Randy Couture, Dan Henderson, Matt Lindland, and Evan Tanner. Then there's Tier 2, the up-and-coming guys like Chris Lieben, Nate Quarry, Ed Herman, Matt Horwich, and Chael Sonnen. These are the up-and-coming guys at the time that are training at Team Quest. So at this point in Chael's career, he started fighting as a professional. He's taken some fights. He's done pretty good, but he's a part-time fighter. And what I mean by that is he's part-time because at that point in the sport, maybe only 4 or 5 guys in the entire industry were able to make a living doing MMA full-time. There's still a lot of guys who are at the top of the mountain in MMA, but the pay isn't that good, so they have to have a side job, or they have to have a full-time job, and MMA is their side job. So Chael is doing this part-time because there isn't enough money in it. And obviously Chael is a very smart guy, and he has interests outside of fighting. So he's a part-time fighter because at this point in his life, he's working in real estate, and he has an interest in politics. He's trying to make a run in the political world because he wants to be the governor of Oregon, his home state. So he has other interests outside of fighting, and he's working as a realtor, and he's got other things going on outside of fighting. So he's part-time because the industry won't allow him to be full-time, but he's also part-time because of his other interests outside of fighting. Then The Ultimate Fighter hits in 2005. And you're wondering to yourself, okay, if he trains with Randy Couture, and Randy Couture was one of the coaches of the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, he trains with Randy, and then I just mentioned 2 guys that were on the show as contestants for that first season of The Ultimate Fighter that he trains with, Nate Quarry and Chris Lieben. So now you got to be thinking to yourself, well, why wasn't Chael Sonnen on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter if those guys were on that show. Why isn't he on that show? Now, the true story behind why he wasn't on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter is because obviously, like I just mentioned, he had other interests outside of fighting at the time, and he was a part-time fighter at this point in his career. Randy Couture asked him to be on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, but Randy really didn't know what the show was about. He really didn't know too much about what the first season of The Ultimate Fighter was going to be about, because Dana White told him very little. He just said, hey, you're going to coach these guys, you're going to be on the show, it's going to be on Spike TV, and that's basically it. So he didn't know, and really none of the contestants knew what the show was going to be. That's why we got the "Do you want to be an effing fighter" speech from Dana White. That's what that's all about, because these guys who are on the show, Lieben, Quarry, Diego Sanchez, Forrest Griffin, Stephan Bonner, Kenny Florian, all those guys, they didn't know what the show was supposed to be about. They didn't know that they were actually going to be fighting. They just thought it was a reality show with some fighters and showing you a day in the life of what it's like to be a fighter in the UFC or be an aspiring MMA fighter. They really didn't know that this was going to be what The Ultimate Fighter turned out to be, which is the toughest tournament in sports, and you have to fight in this tournament, and at the end, you fight at a live finale, and you get a six-figure contract with the UFC and a trophy. They didn't know any of this stuff. So Randy Couture goes to Chael Sonnen and says, hey, you want to be on this show? This is what it is. I don't really know much, but this is it. We got Lieben, we got Quarry, they're going to be on it. Do you want to do it? And because Randy really didn't know what it was about, Chael Sonnen didn't know what it was about. So he tells him no. And then, obviously, The Ultimate Fighter goes on to be the show that it turned out to be. And all these guys who were on that first season of The Ultimate Fighter turn into legends. And all these guys are known in the sport now. So that always was puzzling me about his career, and I'm sure if you're listening to this, it probably puzzled you also about his career. Why wasn't he on that show? And that's the reason why, because he didn't know what it was, and the guys who were telling him about it really didn't know what it was. And he's said in the past, had that been the only way for him to get into the UFC, had he never fought in the UFC, that would have been one of the greatest regrets of his life, not going on that first season of The Ultimate Fighter. And Chael Sonnen is a guy who, like me, loves The Ultimate Fighter. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but that's really where the story starts. So after this happens, after these guys go on The Ultimate Fighter, they get a ton of exposure, they have fans now, they're in the UFC, Chael Sonnen decides, okay, well, this is going to be a turning point in my career. One of many, mind you. But he decides, okay, I'm no longer going to be a part-time fighter. I'm going to be a full-time part-time fighter, meaning I'm going to dedicate myself. I'm going to show up every day and train. Still have to work outside because there's not enough money in the sport, but I'm going to go all in, and I'm going to try not just to be a guy who competes, but I'm going to try to be the world champion. So that's a turning point in his career, the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. And he finally gets his shot in the UFC at UFC 55 in November of 2005. He's fighting a guy named Renato Babalu Sobral. Now, Chael and Babalu have history. Chael was the last man to defeat Babalu. Babalu had lost at UFC 40 via head kick to Chuck Liddell, and then back in the UFC at that point in time, they were only running about 5 or 6 shows a year, so not many people, unless they were champion, got to be exclusive to the UFC. Because they weren't doing a lot of shows and because they weren't paying a whole lot back then, the UFC would allow guys to take fights on the regional circuit if it didn't conflict with their schedule. So Chael fought against Babalu and defeated Babalu by decision. So then Babalu went on this absolute tear and reestablished himself and was now a contender and on his way to getting what he eventually would get, which is a rematch with Chuck Liddell. This time, it would be for the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship, and that fight ended up taking place at UFC 62. So Babalu has reestablished himself as a very tough fighter, a top contender, and someone that a lot of people don't want to fight. And that's how Chael gets his foot in the door. Now, there's 4 stages to Chael Sonnen's career. Right now we're in stage 1, and that's him getting known, getting exposure, his come up in the business. Now, at this point in time, I'm very fascinated by Chael's career, and really beyond this, I'm even more fascinated by his career. And this is one thing I want to hammer home in this video is Chael Sonnen will fight anyone, anywhere, anytime. There's a lot of guys in this business that say they'll fight anyone, anywhere, anytime, but very few of them actually follow up on that. Chael says he'll fight anyone, anywhere, anytime, and he backs it up. He actually does that. So, at this point, Babalu is a guy that nobody wants to fight. But Chael has defeated Babalu in the past. And he sees this as his golden opportunity to get into the UFC and make a run. So he takes the fight against Babalu. And this is another point in Chael's story that I really want you guys to focus in on, because this is really the birth of Chael Sonnen, the guy that we know and love. It didn't happen in 2010. It happened at this point in time. Everything that Chael Sonnen says now, he was saying back then. He had this fight recently against Quentin Rampage Jackson in the Bellator Heavyweight Grand Prix. And in this fight against Rampage, he has a size disadvantage. The experts say that Rampage is a lot heavier than him, and Chael is going to have a tough time fighting against Rampage because he's giving up some size. Now, in this pre-fight build-up to the Rampage fight, he says a line where he goes something like this, where he says, "Yeah, people are saying that I'm giving up some size to Rampage, but I've shoved guys out of the way bigger than Rampage, looking for someone to fight." Now, it's a great line. Don't get me wrong. It's a great line. I remember I was watching that fight and the UFC fight between Stipe Miocic and Francis Ngannou. Those 2 fights were on at the same time and the same night. So I'm watching on one screen, I'm watching Chael versus Rampage, and I'm watching Stipe versus Ngannou. And I'm at a restaurant, so I'm watching with people, and they have the audio for the Bellator fight on because that main card started before the UFC, and then they're going to change over and they're going to put on the UFC audio. So I'm watching the Chael Sonnen Rampage fight, and people are, they're loving that line that I just told you, and Chael delivers it perfectly. I'm obviously butchering it. I don't have the quote in front of me, but that's what he says. He says something along those lines, and everyone is loving this quote. Everyone's laughing, whatever. Oh, this is Chael being Chael. This is why we love this guy. But really, it's nothing new. Chael had done that line in the pre-fight build-up to this fight that he had in November of 2005 at UFC 55 against Babalu. Chael's best work historically has taken place at middleweight, and prior to his fight against Babalu, he had made the drop down to 185. So he was fighting at middleweight, but the UFC comes calling. They need someone to fight Babalu at 205, and Chael has a history at 205, so he's not going to turn them down. So he makes his debut in the UFC at light heavyweight, and he says that exact same line that he said against Rampage. He says that exact same line before this fight at UFC 55. He says, "People say that I'm giving up some size to Babalu, but I've shoved bigger guys than Babalu out of the way looking for someone to fight." He says the exact same line. Now, the difference between the line that he says against Rampage and the line that he says against Babalu is Chael wasn't winning at that point in time. Back in 2005, the memory that people had of Chael Sonnen, in 2006, 2007, sometime in that range, the memories that people had about this guy were him yelling into the camera grabbing the fence when Babalu is trying to lock up a heel hook in that fight. That was the memory that people had of Chael Sonnen. So he's saying all these great lines, but he's not winning. He's not producing. So Chael has always been the same guy. He's always been saying the same stuff, but he wasn't winning back then. Had he been winning, he would have become a star quicker. And he would have gotten bigger fights faster than he actually did, and he would have stuck around in the UFC longer if he was producing. He was always the same guy. A lot of people believe that Chael Sonnen just out of nowhere magically became this trash-talking genius, but he was always that guy. He didn't just start doing this in 2009 because he saw Anderson Silva holding the middleweight title. He was doing this a long, long time ago. He was trying, he was very desperate to get his shot in the UFC and make a name for himself in the sport and become champion. There's a lot of stuff that he says, and a lot of the stuff that he says is crazy, but there's truth behind everything that he says. Even though a lot of it is masked with a lot of ridiculous stuff, there is a lot of truth into what he says, and there's a lot of hidden meanings and a lot of stuff that is personal to him. When he says he was fighting at the dog park for peanuts and he wasn't getting his shot, that's true. He was fighting at small venues and he wasn't making any money, and he was seeing guys get opportunities that he wasn't getting. And because he wasn't getting the opportunity to fight against those guys, he couldn't prove it to anyone. Anyone can say, oh, I can beat this guy, beat that guy, but if you don't actually fight them or go out and beat them, no one cares. And if you're not in the show that they're in, and the fights can't be made because of contracts, no one cares. And no one is going to believe you. So that's what Chael fell into in phase 1 of his MMA career. He didn't have the backing of the fans, and there was this perception about him that isn't really true. A lot of people believe that he's just this boring wrestler and he lays in praise, but really, he's actually an exciting fighter to a certain degree. I know he's had some fights in the past that have not been very good, and I know that he's had some fights in the past where he didn't perform well, and he talks about that all the time. He talks about, I wish I had that fight back. I wish I performed better in this fight. My record isn't as good as I'd like it to be. I wish I could have some of those fights back. He talks a lot about his amateur wrestling days. I think he regrets more of the losses that he had in amateur wrestling than he does in MMA. Even though he's had some heartbreaking losses in MMA, sometimes he always brings up his amateur wrestling career in terms of matches that he'd like to have back and losses that he'd like to avenge. A lot of that is in MMA, but it's also in amateur wrestling. So in phase 1 of his MMA career, it's him trying to establish himself, and he really is trying to deliver on what he's saying. He's desperate for a shot in the UFC, and now he's in the UFC and he wants to make the most of it. And that's something that really fascinates me about his career, because he got cut from the UFC because he was taking the hardest fights possible and he was willing to fight anyone, anywhere, anytime. I mean, there really aren't any easy fights in the UFC. Let's be honest about that. Everyone's there for a reason, but he could have taken easier fights than the 3 guys that he fought at the time, and he could have stuck around for a lot longer, and he could have developed in the UFC, and he could have become a star quicker, but he didn't do that. He tried to deliver on his promises that he'll fight anyone and he'll take the hardest fights. He's not a bully because he's going to take fights that he doesn't know that he can win. And the next 2 fights that he has in the UFC live up to that, because he had fought Trevor Prangley 2 times before. He had fought him as an amateur. He fought him back in 1999, and then he fought him a couple of years earlier than the fight that he had at UFC Fight Night 4 in 2006. He fought Prangley twice, And he knows how tough Trevor Prangley is. And a lot of people don't remember Trevor Prangley, but he's a very good wrestler, and he's very strong, and he's very tough. His career doesn't match his skill set. He had a really good career, but his skill set is better than what his career actually turned out to be. So he's a very tough guy and a very tough fight for anyone. And Chael knows what he's getting himself into because he's fought him twice before and he's been defeated by Prangley twice before. So he takes this fight and he defeats Trevor Prangley. So then he comes back and again he takes another tough fight. This time, Evan Tanner was supposed to fight against Jeremy Horn at UFC 60, but Evan Tanner suffered an injury. So Chael Sonnen jumps on this fight because here's a guy in Jeremy Horn that Chael Sonnen has a history with. Jeremy Horn had also defeated Chael Sonnen twice before. I'm pretty sure it's safe to say that Jeremy Horn has Chael Sonnen's number because in this fight, Chael is submitted by Jeremy Horn. So now he's 0-3 against Jeremy Horn. But he takes that fight against Jeremy Horn, who at the time is one of the Militich guys. He's a guy who had fought for the title at UFC 54 against Chuck Liddell and come up short in that fight. But he's a guy who no one wants to fight because he's a very tough guy with a lot of experience and a lot of skill. And he comes from a great camp. So no one wants to take that fight. Chael takes the fight. Now, I'm not sure if he was cut by the UFC after going 1-2 in his first stint in the octagon. I'm not sure because I don't know what the contract looked like back then. If it was a 3-fight deal, then he just fought out his contract and they chose not to re-sign him. But if it was a 4-fight deal, then he was cut in his first stint with the UFC, but I'm not 100% sure on what his contract looked like, and maybe he was just doing single fights, or he had a 2-fight contract and he won that fight against Trevor Prangley, and then they brought him back, and then he was cut after he lost to Jeremy Horn. I'm not exactly sure what his contract looked like, but he never came back to the UFC after that Jeremy Horn fight until he fought against Damian Maia at UFC 95 a few years later. So he leaves the UFC and he goes over to Bodog Fight, and that's really when he develops his skills and he starts to put to rest this idea that he's a boring fighter and this lay and pray guy and this one-dimensional wrestler, because he finishes all these guys. I think he finishes all but one of his fights outside of the UFC, and he goes to Bodog Fight, and he's still carrying that chip on his shoulder, and he's still hoping that he gets a shot again in the UFC because he has unfinished business there. So he goes to Bodog Fight, and he redevelops his skills, and he reinvents himself, and he still is doing what he's doing now. He's doing then. He's hyping fights up. He's saying all the right things, but since he's doing it in Bodog Fight, people don't care. A lot of people who are fans of MMA are just fans of the UFC and they weren't following his career. Or the hardcore fans didn't care about him because of the perception they had about his fighting abilities and his style. So what he's saying is the same stuff that he's saying now, but it's not making an impact, just like the stuff that he was saying in the UFC wasn't making an impact on the fans. But he has a great run in Bodog, and after his run in Bodog ends because they go out of business, again, here he is. He sees an opening because Paulo Filho, at the time, when him and Chael Sonnen fought the first time, Paulo Filho was the number 1 middleweight in the world. No one wanted to fight this guy. He had been over in Pride in Japan doing great work. He was undefeated. He should have won the Pride welterweight Grand Prix. He defeated Kazuo Masaki, the eventual winner of the tournament. He defeated him in that tournament, but since Paulo Filho got injured, Kazuo Masaki took his place and defeated Dennis Kang in that tournament. So he should have won the Pride Grand Prix, but he couldn't continue because he suffered an injury to his knee. So the WEC knows that Anderson Silva and Paulo Filho aren't going to fight. I'm pretty sure it's because they trained together or they had the same manager or something prevented them from fighting. So they have to find someone who will fight against Paulo Filho. And they decide to put him in the WEC and allow him to fight for the vacant middleweight championship. Joe Riggs had been the middleweight champion in WEC, but that was a long time ago, and that was before Zuffa bought WEC. So the title is vacant, and so they bring in Joe Dirksen, who's a very tough Canadian fighter, and Dirksen and Filho fight for the vacant middleweight title, and Filho wins the fight. So now Chael Sonnen sees this as an opportunity to get a title and get back into the UFC. Use this fight and use this belt as a springboard to get back to the UFC. Because here he is again. He sees an opening because nobody wanted to fight Paulo Filho at that time. And that's another common theme in Chael Sonnen's career. He takes fights that nobody wants. You've seen it laid out for you in the previous fights, the Horn fight, the Prangley fight, the Babalu fight. No one wants to fight these guys. So Chael is able to get these fights, and that's going to pay off in his story a little bit later when we get to stuff that happened in his second stint in the UFC. We'll come back to that. So keep in mind, that's how he's able to do this. He steps up when no one else will step up. So he gets this fight against Paulo Filho, and it's very similar to his fight against Anderson Silva that he would have years later at UFC 117, because Chael goes in there and he does a lot of work. He's going in there and he's taking it to Paulo Filho, and it's looking like Chael is going to dominate the fight, possibly eventually stop Filho, but for sure he's going to be able to grind him out and win a 5-round decision. But like a lot of his fights, Chael does great at the beginning, and then he finds a way, some way, somehow, he always finds a way to lose fights that he's winning. It happened pretty much every time he ever lost a fight. It happened this way. He was doing great at the beginning, leading up to this fight against Paulo Filho. All his other losses, he had great moments in those losses, but somehow he found a way to lose. And that's what he means. He says a lot of crazy things, but there is a little bit of truth if you dissect exactly what he's saying. He says a lot of crazy stuff, but when he says, "I've never lost a round in my MMA career," what he means by that is, okay, let's say that he gets submitted in the second round. So technically, he lost the fight, but he didn't lose the round. So let's say that he won the first round 10-9. Well, he won the round, but he lost the fight. When he fought against Paulo Filho, he won the first round, so he won the round, but he got submitted in the second round, so the round ended. Had the round continue, in his mind, he would have won that round, so he's undefeated when it comes to round by round fighting. It makes no sense, and it's clever trash talk, and it's funny or whatever, but when you break it down, that's actually what he's saying. It sounds crazy, but that's what he's talking about, is that he's never lost any rounds. He's lost fights, but he hasn't lost the rounds. So in this Paulo Filho fight, he wins the rounds, but he loses the fight. I don't know. It really doesn't make any sense to me either, but I think it's clever, and now that I know what he's talking about, because I've dissected his career and studied it for many years, that's what he means by he's never lost any rounds. So he has this fight against Paulo Filho. He gets caught in a submission. It's controversial. He yells out. He says that he didn't tap, and, Josh Rosenthal, of course, is the referee, and, he plays a big factor in another fight that he's going to have coming up here soon. So there's controversy, but there's nothing he can do about it. He lost to Paulo Filho. So he goes back to the drawing board and he fights Brian Baker. You might remember him. He fought at middleweight and he fought at welterweight in Bellator. He fought a couple times in some of those tournaments, and he made it pretty far in a lot of those tournaments. So he fights against Brian Baker and he beats Brian Baker up, and then he gets his rematch against Paulo Filho. Now, I always consider Chael Sonnen to be the WEC middleweight champion. I always think of him as the last WEC middleweight champion because we have seen this since this event happened, but at this point in time, we had never seen the reigning defending champion miss weight for a title defense. It had never happened before. There had been challengers that had missed weight for a title fight, but never the champion. Since then, it's happened a lot, but at this point in time, it had never happened. Mark Pavlich, the man who used to run the Maximum Fighting Championship, he invented this rule. A lot of people think it was the UFC or the Nevada State Athletic Commission or a Athletic Commission, but really, it was the MFC. Mark Pavlich came up with this idea because why should the contender, or if it's a vacant title, one of the guys, the guy who makes weight, why should he be punished? So Mark Pavlich was the guy who first started using this, where even when one guy misses weight, the title will still be on the line and the fight will go for 5 rounds. He was the first guy to do this. That's a little fun fact for you guys. Mark Pavlich of the MFC, he invented this. So I always consider Chael to be the last WEC middleweight champion because of this rule that's in place now. I wish they would go back and overturn it and give him the belt because he did everything right. He made weight. It was Paul Filho that screwed him because Paul Filho didn't make weight. I know they made it right technically because Paul Filho's team gave Chael Sonnen the belt, so now in his office, hanging up on his wall is Paul Filho's belt. It should be his belt. I wish they would go back and overturn that because the rules are different now. I don't think they'll ever do it, but I would like to see that. So Chael goes in there and he takes it to Paul Filho in this fight. And it's only a 3 5-minute round fight because Filho didn't make weight. Chael would have probably stopped him if it was a 5-minute round fight, because Filho was doing a lot of crazy stuff. He was talking to ghosts and he was seeing a lot of crazy stuff. He was seeing spirits. He was talking to dead ancestors. I don't know what he was doing, but he's looking around. He wanted out of the fight, but the referee didn't grant his wishes, so he was able to survive and fight the entire fight, and Chael ends up winning. So he's able to capitalize off, at this point in time, the biggest win of his career, and he's able to make the jump to the UFC because he's proven himself in the WEC. And when the WEC decided to eliminate those weight classes, light heavyweight, middleweight, and welterweight, when they decided to fold them over into the UFC, they took all the top UFC guys and put them, or the WEC guys, and put them in the UFC. Guys like Carlos Condit, Chael, Brian Stan, guys like that. So he makes his return to the UFC. He's finally got another chance in the UFC, and this begins phase 2 of his career. But again, he gets into trouble because he can't capitalize off what he's built up in the WEC and the performance that he had against Paul Filho, because he goes in and he loses to Damian Maia. And that becomes a common theme in his career. He does great work. He does everything right. He sells himself. He builds up the fights. He promotes himself well. He gets people invested, whether they want to see him win or they want to see him lose. They have an opinion about him. They have feelings towards the fight. But then he loses momentum. It's happened to him a lot. He does all the right things, but for some reason, he keeps fumbling when he gets to the goal line. And that's what happens in this Damian Maia fight. He loses the fight to Damian Maia, so now he has to take a step back and reevaluate and reestablish himself and make up lost ground. So he gets right back on the horse. Yushin Okami is supposed to fight against Dan Miller at UFC 98, but Yushin Okami pulled out of the fight, so Dan Miller needs a new opponent. Now, he's supposed to be fighting against Ed Herman. Ed Herman is supposed to be the guy who replaces Yushin Okami, but I don't remember what the reason was, but Ed Herman ended up not getting that fight, and they ended up going with Chael Sonnen. Now, here we are again. Going down this same road, a common theme of Chael Sonnen's career, another fight against a guy that no one wants to fight. And Chael Sonnen steps up and he delivers. Because at this point in time, Dan Miller was a very scary guy. There's a fight he had in the IFL. You should look it up. Just type in Dan Miller guillotine choke on YouTube and you'll find it. And it's the nastiest guillotine choke you'll ever see. He touches the guy's ear to his sternum. It's like the craziest guillotine choke. He really cranks the neck. And Dan Miller was a great fighter at that point in time. Chael really took his soul after this fight at UFC 98 because Chael went in there and did work. And Dan Miller was never the same after this fight at UFC 98. But at the time, Dan Miller was a very scary guy. He was undefeated in the UFC, and he was the last IFL middleweight champion. So he's a very tough guy, very skilled. Chael goes in there, wins the fight. So now he has some momentum. Then he fights against Yushin Okami at UFC 104. So he fights against Okami and he beats Okami. Now he's calling out Anderson Silva. He wants to take it to Anderson Silva. He believes that Anderson Silva is not fighting guys that are on his level. He believes that he can go in there and take that title. But he's not in position right now for that title fight because Vitor Belfort had just fought against Rich Franklin at UFC 103 and knocked out Rich Franklin. And Vitor Belfort had been doing great work outside the UFC. He was coming off a nasty knockout against one of Chael Sonnen's teammates, Matt Lindland, at Affliction Day of Reckoning. So Vitor Belfort is going to get the fight against Anderson Silva at UFC 112. So there isn't really a path right now for Chael Sonnen to get a title fight. Same thing is said about Nate Marquardt. Nate Marquardt had fought against Anderson Silva at UFC 73 and lost to Anderson Silva. So he really wants that rematch. So Chael is not really in a position for a title fight just yet, and Nate Marquardt is not in position for a title fight just yet. So let's match those two guys up. And so they fight at UFC 109. And in the build-up to that fight, it's all one-way traffic for Nate Marquardt. Everyone believes Nate Marquardt is going to go in there and knock out Chael Sonnen. Or if Chael is able to execute his game plan and get the fight to the ground, it's only going to be a matter of time before Nate Marquardt catches him in a submission like we've seen so many other guys do to Chael. So in the pre-fight build-up to the fight, Chael is doing his routine, and he's doing a great job, but he's still not clicking because he still doesn't have that signature win yet. He still hasn't made it to that level that he needs to get people on board and to jump guys who are ahead of him in line for a title shot. So he needs this win against Nate Marquardt. So he goes in there and he does work against Nate Marquardt, and he rises to the occasion and he delivers on the promises that he's making. And you can say what you want about Chael Sonnen, but win, lose, or draw, he always delivers. He always comes to fight. He always comes forward. And that's what he does against Nate Marquardt. He just goes right through Nate Marquardt. And he wins the fight, and again, he's calling out Anderson Silva. He wants that fight. Now, in the fight, in the third round, he gets this huge gash in his forehead, and that's going to play a factor in the coming months of Chael getting that title shot. So Chael has proven himself. He's talked a big game, and he's backed it up, and he defeated Nate Marquardt, the guy who a lot of people believed at the time, if he was given a second opportunity to fight against Anderson Silva, he could defeat Anderson Silva. So Vitor Belfort is supposed to get that fight, but Vitor ends up getting injured. Now, Chael can't take that fight at UFC 112 in Abu Dhabi against Anderson Silva because Chael is suspended. He has a medical suspension by the commission because of that gash that he has in his forehead, and it won't be healed up in time for him to train and get ready for a fight against Anderson Silva. So Damian Maia, who had fought on the same card and defeated Chael in the past. He fought on that same UFC 109 card against Dan Miller, and he won that fight, so he becomes the new number one contender. Vitor can't fight, Chael can't fight, so let's give the fight to Damian Maia. Now, we all know what ended up happening at UFC 112. It was a disaster. Dana White was disgusted. He didn't even put the belt around Anderson Silva's waist. He gives it to Ed Soares. Ed Soares does it. It's not a pretty sight. Dana White's making threats. If Anderson pulls this again, we'll cut him. No one wants to see this crap. No one wants to see him fight this way. We're not going to do that anymore. Now, Chael, because of his political background and because he's a pretty good politician, I know he had to drop out of the race for the Oregon Assembly because of some stuff that he did in his business life with real estate and stuff like that. We're not talking about his personal life. We're talking about his fight life in this video. So he's had issues, but he is a gifted politician. So because of his political background, he's able to feed off of what the people want. And the people are fed up with Anderson Silva, for the most part. There's a lot of people that love Anderson Silva and are fans of his fighting style and are fans of him. They know that he's had some pretty bad performances. The Damian Maia fight, he dominated Damian Maia, but it was not an exciting fight. Damian Maia didn't have anything to offer him, and it wasn't that great of a fight. He had a fight against Patrick Cote that ended anticlimactic because he injured his leg. He had the fight against Talis Latis that was not that great. He did have some good fights against James Irvin and Forrest Griffin, but they were overshadowed by his middleweight title defenses. So people are turning on Anderson. The promotion is turning on him. Some of the fans are turning on him. They're fed up with what they've seen from him. So Chael, being the politician that he is and being the guy who will play to the crowd, he catches wind of this and he has his finger on the pulse because he is such a big MMA fan. He knows what the MMA community wants. He goes after Anderson Silva, and that's the brilliance of Chael Sonnen's trash talk and his political background, how he's able to mix the two together. Because look at Donald Trump. Look at the people that he went after in the primaries and in the general election. He went after Jeb Bush. No one likes Jeb Bush. No one cares about the Bush family. So when he goes off on Jeb Bush, no one cares. He's playing to the crowd. Everyone loves it. He goes off on John McCain. No one likes John McCain. John McCain's a loser. No one cares about him. So when Donald Trump goes off on John McCain, everyone loves it. Everyone thinks it's great. He goes off against Hillary Clinton. No one likes Hillary Clinton. If people liked Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump wouldn't be the president right now because Donald Trump's approval ratings are very low, but Hillary Clinton, obviously, her approval ratings are lower because she didn't win. So when Donald Trump goes off on all these people, he goes off on people that people don't like. Rosie O'Donnell, people don't like her. People don't care. They think it's funny when Donald Trump makes fun of her. So that's what Chael does. He always goes after the guys that people don't like. For the most part, he has gone after some guys who people are fans of, but he does it in a way that even if you're a fan of that guy, you still have to enjoy what Chael is saying. So he goes off on Anderson the way Donald Trump goes off on his political opponents and public rivals, I guess you could say. So he starts to go off on Anderson Silva, and he has some of the best trash talk lines leading up to a fight ever. His pre-fight build-up to UFC 117 is epic. He has a Q&A at UFC 115 when Chuck Liddell fought against Rich Franklin. He has a great Q&A. He says all these great lines. There's this guy who, and obviously I'm going to make this quicker because you guys have all seen these lines. If you're listening to this video, you know the lines, but he says the thing about, this is Anderson Silva's fan. I don't think I'd ever have a chance to meet you, but I heard that he had one, and like everyone has a big laugh, and then he says the thing about the Nogueira brothers. He says all this great stuff. And the UFC 117 pre-fight press conference, some epic lines are flying out of Chael Sonnen's mouth. Thiago Alves, go back and watch that press conference. Thiago Alves can't keep a straight face. He's cracking up the entire time. It's great. And he's saying that he's going to dominate Anderson Silva. He's going to go in there. He's got all the answers. He's going to be the guy to do it. And he goes in there, and at UFC 117 in August of 2010, he goes in there and he backs up what he says. He dominates Anderson Silva for 4.5 rounds. It's one of the greatest performances of his career. Everything's looking great. He's looking like he's going to finally live out his dream and become the UFC middleweight champion. Everything's going his way. Everything's looking great. But here we go again. The story of his life. He somehow finds a way to lose the fight. And Anderson Silva catches him in a triangle. We all know what happened. You know the story. We don't have to relive it. But he loses the fight to Anderson Silva. Now, because he was so good in the pre-fight build-up, and because he was so good in the fight, and because he backed up everything he said, he started that day the number one contender in the UFC middleweight division. And he ended the day as the number one contender in the UFC middleweight division. Everyone, for the most part, wanted to see the fight against Chael Sonnen and Anderson Silva, because a lot of people thought that, okay, Chael has talked a lot of crazy stuff in the pre-fight build-up, and Anderson is going to go in there, and he's going to be motivated like he hasn't been in some of his previous fights at middleweight, and Anderson is going to go in there, and he's going to dominate Chael, and he's going to knock him out, and Chael is going to be a laughingstock because Anderson is just going to dominate him in a very quick and violent fashion. But Chael backs it up. Everything that he said he was going to do, he does in the fight, except he doesn't win. He ends up getting submitted. So he does everything that he says, and people are excited about seeing a rematch. But then we have to go on this odyssey because Chael gets suspended. And to shorten the story, he has to go away for a while because he has elevated levels of testosterone. It's a very long and confusing story, but he has to go away for a while. So Anderson, he goes off, he front kicks Vitor Belfort in the face, he defeats Yushin Okami. Chael, on the other hand, he goes out, he beats Brian Stann at UFC 136. Chael really starts to make his mark in MMA, and this is really where you can look back on his career and point to the time where he started to, in a weird, funny, strange way you're going to laugh, really start to change the game. Because this is where Chael develops the technique that everyone should be using, even though a lot of people fight back against this. A lot of people should be using this technique. A lot of people have tried to imitate what Chael's done and failed, but a lot of guys who could succeed doing it this way aren't doing it this way. But this is where Chael abandons the, I'm going to take everything one fight at a time. This is really where he abandons that. And this is also where he abandons the, I'm going to create drama to sell a fight. He doesn't do that. And there's a reason why he doesn't manufacture drama against anyone, because when he does have bad blood with someone, we won't believe that he has bad blood against them. He doesn't manufacture drama that's not there because he respects Brian Stann, and Brian Stann is a very nice guy. He's never said anything bad about anyone, and no one has ever said anything bad about Brian Stann, so there's no drama whatsoever. But he's starting to build up fights in the future. He's building up fights not only with Anderson Silva, he's also building up fights with Vitor Belfort. He's getting people excited. He's drumming up interest in future fights the same way he built up interest with the fight that he had against Yushin Okami. He didn't have any beef with Yushin Okami, but he has beef with other guys, and he wants bigger fights, and he wants to make a run at the title, so he goes after them. And he does the same thing in this Brian Stann fight. And the thing that I find fascinating about the Brian Stann fight is no one remembers how the fight actually went down. A lot of people think that he just went in there and he decisioned Brian Stann in a boring fight. A lot of people forget that he went in there and he took it to Brian Stann and he submitted him with an arm triangle choke. It was a brilliant performance out of Chael. A top 4, top 5 performance in his career. So he goes in there and he defeats Brian Stann, and he's laid the groundwork for an epic post-fight interview with Joe Rogan. We all know something great is going to happen because we want to see that rematch with Anderson Silva. We're dying to see it. We have to see this rematch because he came so close to winning the fight the first time. So we all know that he's going to call out Anderson Silva. And he delivers the epic post-fight interview that everyone remembers. You might not remember the fight, but you remember the interview. He gets the mic and he goes, "Anderson Silva, you absolutely suck. Super Bowl weekend, the biggest rematch in the history of the business. I'm calling you out, Silva, but we're up in the stakes. I beat you. You leave the division. You beat me, and I will leave the UFC forever." And then he walks off. Epic post-fight interview. Absolutely great. Might be number one, depending on who you talk to. Just a great post-fight interview. Again, showing everybody in the industry how it's done, how you set up the next fight, and giving the people what they want. Because everyone would have been disappointed if he would have said something about the fight or said something about he'll take whoever the UFC will give him. Something like that. So, if you're an up-and-coming fighter, take some notes. Or if you're a guy in the UFC right now, take notes. So, we all think that Chael is going to get this rematch with Anderson Silva, and then there's all kinds of drama on why this fight can't be put together and blah, blah, blah. So he ends up having to take a fight on Fox against Mark Munoz. But Mark Munoz can't make the fight because he gets injured. So instead of fighting Mark Munoz, he has to fight against Michael Bisping. And Michael Bisping is a guy who Chael Sonnen has been talking about in the past. He knows that eventually they're going to meet because he was supposed to coach opposite Michael Bisping on season 14 of The Ultimate Fighter, but since Chael was suspended and there was other drama that led to him being pulled from the show and replaced with Jason Mayhem Miller, we're finally going to get this Bisping fight because it was supposed to be Michael Bisping versus Chael Sonnen at The Ultimate Fighter finale once the show wrapped, and that was going to be Chael's first fight back since his suspension. So we're finally going to get this Bisping fight, and it comes up on short notice, unfortunately, so we're not treated to a proper build-up to the fight and some back and forth between two really good trash talkers, because Bisping is no slouch in that department. He's very good also. So Chael ends up winning that fight, and now it's clear there's no more fights to be made for those guys. They have to fight now, and the rematch is going to happen at UFC 148 in July of 2012. So just under 2 years we've had to wait for this rematch. And in the build-up to this fight, it's even better. He goes off on Brazil. He starts saying all this stuff. He starts carrying around a fake belt and saying that Anderson has a fake belt. And he says that Anderson didn't win that fight and Chael Sonnen is the real champion and he's defending the belt. And Anderson now is going for a rematch because Anderson has to prove that he's the better fighter and has to get his belt back and reestablish himself. So Chael is granting him a rematch. Like it's wild build up to the fight. So if you thought the first fight that they had in 2010 at UFC 117, if you thought that build-up was good, this one is even better. And the press conference for UFC 117 was epic, but the press conference for UFC 148 before the fight happens is way better. And Chael really goes off. He goes off on everybody, and he starts dropping all of his great lines, and he drops the line that he's used many times, and he's used it in a lot of his fights since then, and really there's two big lines that he uses. The first line that he uses is the line where he goes, "I'm like Jon Jones, I sound like Sean Combs, and I've got trombone-sized stones like John Holmes." He uses that line, and then he also uses the line, "It's going to be one more in the win column, one more for the highlight reel, and one more for the bad guy." He starts using that line, and everyone's loving it. Everyone thinks it's great. He's really, not that he had to sell people that he could win the fight, and not because he had to sell people on the idea of getting him a rematch. He builds it up even more. So now he has everyone's attention, even though we were already looking for the fight. But he delivers again because he gives us the great lines that we want. So goes in there, he fights against Anderson Silva, and again, a common theme in his career, and this is another thing that's fascinated me about his career, is that for some reason, in the big moments, he's always cost himself. Every fight that he's lost, he's been winning, and he cost himself. The Anderson fight at UFC 117, he was winning. He could have just avoided Anderson for the last round and walked away with the decision 4-1, and been the UFC middleweight champion. This time around, he wins the first round, and then he comes back and he throws an ill-advised spinning back elbow. He falls, and Anderson capitalizes off that mistake. Who knows what happens in the fight if Chael sticks with the game plan that he was using in the first round. And a lot of people were like, oh, well, why did he do that? But that was something that he was practicing before the fight. He thought that he could catch Anderson with that elbow. So he loses this fight, and people are disappointed if they're a Chael fan. I mean, if you're an Anderson fan, you think this is great because Chael has lost 2 fights to Anderson, and he's had to face the music twice and answer for all the stuff that he said, and he didn't get the belt. So if you're an Anderson fan, you think this is great. But if you're a fan of old Chael, you're disappointed because you're not going to get a third fight. It's now 2-0 Anderson Silva. If Chael had won, it would have been 1-1, and we would have been guaranteed a third fight because everyone would want to see these guys fight again. I think there's still a lot of people out there today who would like to see Anderson and Chael fight again, even though Chael has lost 2 times to Anderson. So people are disappointed because now it doesn't make sense for him to fight against Anderson again, and he doesn't have a path to a title at middleweight. So this begins phase 3 of 4 of the phases of Chael Sonnen's career, because now phase 1 of Chael's career is him getting noticed, him getting in the UFC and making a run. Phase 2 was going after the belt and turning himself into a star and doing all the big things that he said he was going to do, delivering on them. And for the most part, even though he lost those fights against Anderson, he still delivered. He still comes to fight. He still brings it. Yes, he lost both those fights, but he delivered in the Nate Marquardt fight. He won that fight. He delivered in some of his other fights, and he backed up everything he said he was going to do. So even though he's 0-2 against Anderson, phase 2 of his career can still be considered somewhat of a success. So phase 3 begins because now he's not on the road to a middleweight title shot anymore, and he's lost 2 fights to Anderson, so he's going to go back up to light heavyweight, and he's going to try to figure out what he has to do to get into the mix at 205. So the first fight that he's scheduled to take is going to be at UFC 155 against Forrest Griffin. Now, Chael and Forrest Griffin have a history because Chael fought against Forrest Griffin and was submitted via triangle choke in the IFC Global Domination Tournament. And that was a great tournament that featured Chael, Forrest, Trevor Prangley, Babalu, Shogun. A lot of great guys were in that tournament. A lot of people consider that to be one of the greatest tournaments, not just in the light heavyweight division, but in the history of the sport. A lot of people believe that's a great tournament. So Chael wants to avenge that loss against Forrest Griffin because, you know, in his earlier interviews, he talks about some of those fights. You know, early on in my career, I'm embarrassed about my record and I want some of those fights back. This is one of the fights that he wants back. So it makes sense. Okay, Chael can get a new start in a new division. He can fight a guy that he's fought in the past and have the opportunity to avenge a loss. And Forrest is a big name guy, former light heavyweight champion in the UFC. So the fight makes sense, but Chael doesn't have any drama to a certain degree with Forrest Griffin because Forrest Griffin is a nice guy and he is a character and there's no bad blood. Even though Chael wants to avenge that loss, there's no drama. There's no heat between those two. So he does what he does better than anyone else and he does what he does famously. He starts to go after guys that are at the top, guys that he does have a beef with, and he starts to go after them. Guys like Wanderlei Silva, who he doesn't like. Guys like Vitor Belfort, that he's hoping that he can get him into a fight, even though Vitor is setting himself up in the middleweight division for a title shot. He's still hoping that maybe him and Vitor can fight each other at a later date. So he's going off on the guys that he doesn't like, but he's also going off on the guy who's at the top of the game, and that's Jon Jones, who's the UFC light heavyweight champion. He starts going off on Jon Jones. He starts building up that fight because he doesn't have any beef with Forrest Griffin, and he also has a lot of time on his hands because the fight at UFC 155 is later in the year, and Jon Jones is getting ready for a fight against Dan Henderson at UFC 151. So Chael starts to get things going between him and Jon Jones, which works out perfectly for Chael because when Dan Henderson gets injured, Chael is right there to capitalize on that opportunity because he's already built up and started to sell people why he should fight against Jon Jones. Now, I don't really know what the true story is, and I don't know if we'll ever know the true story. Part of me believes it's true, but there's another part of me that believes that it could also be false, but I don't know if he had insider info to Dan Henderson getting injured. Now, obviously, they're friends, and they've trained together in the past, and they do talk to each other from time to time. So it is possible that Dan Henderson tipped Chael off. And the reason why Chael started to go after Jon Jones is because he knew that Dan Henderson was injured, and there's a good chance that Dan Henderson isn't going to be able to make the fight, and Chael can jump in there and get that fight against Jon Jones and get a title shot and possibly cut the line ahead of other guys who will possibly be asking for that fight. So I don't know if it's true or not. I'm going to assume that it's true because both guys have said they talked to each other in the past, but again, who the hell knows? But Jon Jones and Dan Henderson aren't going to be able to fight at UFC 151 because Dan Henderson gets injured. So now Chael is ready, willing and able to take that fight, and he's offering his services to the UFC when they don't have an opponent for Jon Jones at UFC 151. Now, here's another thing that people get wrong about Chael Sonnen's career. We've gone over several things, but this is another point that I want to hammer home in this video. And, okay, maybe at a later date, I'll interview Chael Sonnen, and we'll talk about this, and he'll tell me that I'm wrong, but I believe I'm right. Chael Sonnen never talked his way into any fight. Now, that's going to be hard for some of you people to believe because you've heard some of the stuff that he said, and you see what happens when he says some of this stuff. Good things happen to him, and he gets big fights. Some of you will say that he gets fights that he doesn't deserve, and some of you will say that he gets fights that are bigger than what he deserves, and he makes fights bigger than what they are. And because he talks so much, he gets rewarded for that instead of awarded big fights based on where he's at in terms of the rankings and his fighting ability and the abilities of his opponent. But you're wrong because Chael didn't talk his way into this fight. He stepped up and took this fight when no one else would. A common theme, if you've been following along in this video, of his career. Chael stepped up when the other guys stepped back. Now, Chael had a lot going against him in terms of being a credible opponent and deserving of a title shot against Jon Jones. Chael was coming off a loss, coming from a lower weight class and rejoining a weight class that he hadn't fought in many, many years. He hadn't fought at 205 in a long time, and his run at 205 hadn't been great. Like I said earlier, his best work historically has come at 185, at middleweight. So he had a lot going against him, but no one else wanted it. Forrest Griffin, why didn't he want the fight? Why wasn't he calling up Dana? Lyoto Machida was on a plane ride to Brazil. I don't really remember why he was on that plane ride. He had just come off a win, and he had already fought against Jon Jones at UFC 140. but I don't remember exactly why he was on that plane ride. I don't remember if it was just he was on a vacation and he was just going back to Brazil to relax, or if it was because a family member was ill. I don't exactly remember why he was on that plane ride, but he wasn't able to take the fight because that's the guy they wanted Jon Jones to fight against. Had he picked up the phone, it would have been Machida, but Machida was nowhere to be found and couldn't be reached. So it's crazy when people say that Chael Sonnen talked his way into this fight because no one else wanted it. Chael didn't have the proper resume to get the title fight, so all these other guys who were fighting at 205 could have gotten that fight. Ryan Bader, how come he wasn't looking to avenge a loss? He had fought against Jon Jones in the past. Why wasn't he looking to fight for the title? Why wasn't he calling up Dana, begging him for this fight? Phil Davis, why wasn't he begging for this fight? I know he had lost to Rashad Evans, another guy who wasn't asking for the fight, and had fought against Jon Jones in the past and had bad blood with Jon Jones. It didn't really matter if they were coming off a loss or whatever because Chael was coming off a loss at a lower weight class. So I don't know what the big deal is. How come Alexander Gustafsson or Glover Teixeira or Jimmy Manoa, how come they weren't calling up Dana White and begging him for this title shot? Why weren't they talking trash to Jon Jones and trying to force Jon Jones into a title fight with them? Why weren't they calling this guy out? Why weren't they hitting up Dana? Chael Sonnen stepped up when no one else would. So you can't say that he talked his way into a fight if no one else wanted that fight. He was the only guy who was willing to fight Jon Jones on short notice. So the fight is set. Chael Sonnen signs the bout agreement. He's going to take on Jon Jones for the UFC light heavyweight title on short notice. So we think we have a fight made. People are somewhat happy in a way that Chael's getting this title fight because he's been talking a lot and was selling people on this fight. But for the most part, everyone is pissed off that Chael is getting this title fight because they don't believe that he deserves it. And to a certain degree, you're right, he doesn't deserve a title shot, but then Jon Jones turns it down, and this is where, and we're not going to talk about Jon Jones today, we're going to talk about him at a later date, I'm going to do a video on him, but this is really bad for Jon Jones and really bad for his brand because, okay, he eventually fights Chael Sonnen at UFC 159, and he absolutely destroys Chael in that fight. He could have done that at UFC 151. He didn't need a full training camp to take out Chael Sonnen. I love Chael. Chael's a great fighter, but Chael's not on the same level as Jon Jones. It didn't matter. There was nothing Chael could have done to win that fight. It probably would have been worse had Chael not had a full training camp. I know he said in the past that it would have been an advantage to him because he would have been coming on short notice and he would have had a little bit more mystery in the build-up. I think Jon Jones would have done exactly the same thing to him. Maybe, okay, let's say it might have happened in a later round. Maybe it would have happened in the second or third round instead of the first, but eventually Chael was going to get stopped. So that's bad on Jon Jones. So he doesn't take the fight, and instead he fights against Vitor Belfort at UFC 152. And this really irritated me because I wanted to see the Chael fight. I don't know why they bailed out on Chael and decided to match him up against Vitor Belfort. But they ended up doing that, and Vitor had Jon Jones in a bunch of trouble, and it was looking like Jon Jones was going to get submitted and suffer his first true loss in MMA. But Jon Jones was able to get out of it, and he ends up submitting Vitor Belfort. So now the fight to make, a lot of people believe now, okay, well, Chael, you got to go back to the drawing board, and you got to find someone else at 205 to fight, and you got to earn your way. Because Jon Jones is going to fight against Dan Henderson. Because Dan is going to be healthy now and able to take the fight. But Dan, his knee is still injured, so he's not able to take the fight. But then Jon Jones gets injured, so he's not able to fight against Lyoto Machida. So now they're in a weird position because the number one contender can't fight because of an injury, and the champion can't fight because of an injury. So what are we going to do? How about we rebook this Chael Sonnen fight because people want to see this fight because it led to a cancellation of a card because Jon Jones didn't want to take the fight. some fans who are, ridiculous, they believe that Jon Jones is afraid of Chael Sonnen and he's ducking him and all this stuff. So let's match up Chael with Jon Jones, but we're going to have them coach season 17 of The Ultimate Fighter. Then when that season's over, they're going to fight. So season 17 of The Ultimate Fighter comes around, and The Ultimate Fighter, in Chael's mind, is not a reality show. It's a show about the next generation of fighters. It's a show about helping these guys get through this very tough tournament where they're being tested physically, mentally, emotionally. They're in an awkward situation because, yes, there's two teams, but every man for himself. That's the name of the game. Because look at how that season played out. Kelvin and Uriah Hall, the two guys who made it into the finals in that season, they're both on Team Darkside. They're both on Chael Sonnen's team. So it's every man for himself. There's teams because that's how you train, but in the show, there are no teams. This is an individual sport, and Chael knows that. So he's taking this very serious, the coaching, and he's not only coaching his guys and showing them the way and teaching them everything that he's learned over the course of a long career, but he's also taken Jon Jones's team under his wing. And him and Jon Jones are not rivals. They're not manufacturing drama. They haven't become two guys who hate each other because of going through this show like we've seen so many times before. We've seen coaches not like each other after a season of The Ultimate Fighter because tension has built up through the 8 weeks or whatever of filming. Or we see two guys who are matched up as coaches because they're rivals, like how Chael and Vanderlei Silva were matched up on season 3 of Tough Brazil. Those two guys only were the coaches for that season because they hate each other. But this season, it doesn't play out like that. And this season, you really get to see some of the other layers to who Chael Sonnen is as a person. We've seen him as the world's greatest showman, and we've seen him talk a lot about his opponents, and we've seen him talk about his skills, and we've seen him go off on his rivals. We've seen all this stuff, but now we get to see Chael the man. We get to see Chael in a different light, and he does a great job on this season. It's one of the best seasons of The Ultimate Fighter, as you probably know if you're still listening to this. You've probably seen this season, so you know what I'm talking about. But Chael has a great season. It's a fantastic season of The Ultimate Fighter. Everyone seems to be getting along. Some of those guys that were on that season I've interviewed, and a lot of those guys, regardless of team, ended up training with each other. They stayed together. It was like a big family, even though it was every man for himself and there were two teams. But it's really a good season. So at the end, Jon Jones and Chael Sonnen fight at UFC 159 when the season ends, and here we go again. Chael Sonnen, bad luck. He has bad luck against Paulo Filho the second time because Paulo Filho misses weight and costs Chael the opportunity to fight for the title and win that title. First fight against Anderson Silva, he dominates for 4.5 rounds, finds a way to lose. Second fight against Anderson Silva, throws that spinning back elbow that he shouldn't have done, and Anderson capitalizes on it. And here we are again with bad luck. The Jon Jones fight, Jon Jones's toe almost is ripped off, and had the fight gone past the first round, had they gone to their corner, Jon Jones wouldn't have been able to fight in the second round because the commission and the doctor would have stopped the fight because Jon Jones's toe was almost falling off, and you know what it looks like. And if you don't know, if you're a newer fan, go Google it. It's disgusting. So Chael would have been the UFC light heavyweight champion had Jon Jones gone to a second round and had to go back to his corner, and they would have looked at that injury and said, okay, you can't fight. So that would have been fun had Chael become the UFC light heavyweight champion, because it would have been great build-up for a rematch. He would have said a bunch of crazy stuff talking about how he tore off Jon Jones's toe and all. I mean, could you imagine what he was going to say? It would have been epic, the funny stuff that would have come out of this guy's mouth. And he would have been talking a lot of stuff, and he would have really... He says that he wouldn't feel like he was the champion because people have asked him about this, but what he really means and what he says to build up a fight sometimes are not the same. So he would have, deep down inside of him, not believed he was the champion, but he would have sold the people on a rematch that he is the champion. So it would have been interesting to see that. But here we are again, starting a new phase in Chael's career, because here he is. Phase 3 is him getting a fresh start in a new weight class. But now here he is. He drops another fight, so he's now on a 2-fight losing streak. He's in a new weight class, but he's lost to the champion. So now he doesn't have a path to any title belt. He doesn't have a path to the middleweight belt because he's lost twice to Anderson Silva, and he doesn't have a path to the light heavyweight belt because he lost to Jon Jones. So now he has to start phase 4 of his career. He's got all the fame, he's got popularity, he's got money, he's got everything that he's ever wanted, but he doesn't have the opportunity to get back to a title. So now he's got to do another thing, and he's got to change it up again. And this time, he's got to go after his rivals. He's got to go after the guys he doesn't like. He's got to go after the, quote, big money fights. But this is another thing that people don't get right. The reason why Chael is in big money fights is because Chael is a big draw. The reason why his fights sell is because people want to see him fight. They're not big money fights because he says so. They're big money fights because people want to see it happen. That's what a lot of people that are fighting right now don't understand. If you want to be a draw in the game, you got to be a draw. If you want to be paid well, you've got to be worthy of being paid well. There's no such thing as a big money fight if people don't want to see you in that fight. There's a lot of guys, I want big money fights, but no one cares about you. I want big money fights, but no one wants to see you fight. I want big money fights, but you're not in a position for that. So this is where Chael starts to hunt Wanderlei Silva, and he starts to go after Vitor Belfort. And a lot of people believe, okay, Chael's career will not be complete unless he fights these two guys. He's said a lot of things. He doesn't like them. He's got to fight against them. But again, here we are. He has to go on this odyssey. All these Brazilian guys put him on this ring around the rosy type deal where he has to go through a bunch of guys to get those fights. He had to do it for Anderson. He's got to do it for Wanderlei this time because that's the fight that the fans want to see. So now he's an analyst for Fox. He was doing work as a TV analyst for UFC on Fuel TV, but Fuel was being rebranded into Fox Sports 1 or Fox Sports 2. I don't really remember, but it's being rebranded. So the first ever event, the first ever live sporting event for Fox Sports 1 is going to be Chael Sonnen versus Shogun on Fox Sports 1 in the main event. And this was the first day the channel launched. So Fox Sports 1 was never a channel until this night. So Chael goes in there, and Chael has a great submission game, and he's got a great squeeze. So he goes in there and he submits Shogun. So he delivers, because he delivers on multiple levels. He delivers because he's an analyst on Fox Sports 1, and so he can't let the network down. He can't let the people that he works with down. How's he going to go back on a 3-fight losing streak and talk the stuff that he's been talking? He has to deliver, and he delivers. Then he delivers a second time because he gets back in the win column. He goes in there, has a great performance against Shogun, and now people are excited about him again. If he loses, he's back in that boat that he once was in. Okay, he talks great, he does this, he does that, but he doesn't win, so who cares? But he delivers, and he wins the fight. So the third thing that happens, and very important to the story, is because he won, and because he took no damage, okay, let's go. Wanderlei Silva, that's the fight to make. Now we're going to get it. Wrong. He has to go through Rashad Evans to get the fight. But Chael, textbook technique in what you're supposed to do, him and Rashad Evans are friends. So what's he going to do? He can't hype up a fight with Rashad Evans. This is a friend and colleague. So he goes after Wanderlei Silva even harder than what he did before. And even though he's fighting Rashad Evans, everyone's like, okay, let's get through this fight. Please have him not get injured. Win, lose, or draw, who cares? We want to see Chael and Wanderlei fight. So, of course, he goes in there and Rashad Evans beats him, but he's still calling out Vanderlei. So we're going to get this Vanderlei-Silva fight. And then we all know what ended up happening. He got suspended and had to retire, and Vanderlei-Silva got suspended, a lifetime suspension at the time. That has since obviously been lifted because he came back and fought against Chael, but he gets a lifetime suspension, so the fight can't be made. And a lot of people are disappointed. Chael ends up getting fired from Fox, and all kinds of stuff happened. But he still wants to come back and fight, even though he says he's retired. Now, the original plan when Chael decides to make his comeback, the original plan was for him to go on a tough redemption type season. You know that season we had that just happened that Jesse Taylor won? Well, Chael wanted to be on The Ultimate Fighter, not as a coach, but as a contestant. He wanted to make his comeback in the Ultimate Fighter house and be a contestant on The Ultimate Fighter. He wanted to do similar to what Kimbo Slice did, even though Kimbo Slice never fought in the UFC before, but he was a big name in MMA. So he wanted to do the same thing that Kimbo Slice did. He wanted to fight as a contestant on The Ultimate Fighter. He wanted to go through that process, and it would have done great for the ratings. I would have liked to have seen Chael on The Ultimate Fighter. That would have been good. I don't really know if it was ever discussed with Dana. I don't know if Dana White knows that Chael Sonnen wanted to do that, because he ended up obviously going to Bellator. But if he was going to go back to the UFC, he wanted to make his comeback on The Ultimate Fighter. So instead of going back to the UFC, he signs with Bellator, and he says he's going to go on a Legends ass-whooping tour. Now, this is another layer to Chael Sonnen, because yes, he says he's the bad guy, and he says that he, does all this stuff, and he's a gangster or whatever, but he does have honor. And I know you're going to say, oh, well, he got into trouble with this guy and that guy, and he did this wrong, he did that wrong, whatever. But he has honor, because he gets matched up with Tito Ortiz, and he's going to fight in the light heavyweight division in Bellator. And he's defeated Tito Ortiz in the past. During their amateur wrestling days, Chael had a wrestling match against Tito when they were in college. And Tito got pinned by Chael. But Chael never said anything about it. A lot of people didn't know that they wrestled against each other. If the people did know that they wrestled against each other in the past, they never saw the footage. Like, Chael never said anything about this. He never gloated. He never did any of this. He never released the footage. It didn't even get released until the actual fight they had in the build-up to the fight. Bellator released it. So no one knew anything about this. Chael, the guy has honor, and the guy has class. I know you'll say a lot of crazy stuff about him, but the guy, he's not a sore loser. He always faces the music. He never makes excuses. That's another thing that I want to hammer home in this video. He never makes excuses. He never says, oh, my shoulder was hurt, my knee was hurt, my coach gave me bad advice, or, I got Vaseline in my eye, or the referee cost me, or the judges screwed me, and the judges don't know what they're looking at. He never says any of that stuff. He never makes any excuses. He's not a sore loser, and he always faces the music. When he lost to Anderson Silva both times, he's right there. Okay, this is what happened. This is what I'm going to do. I got to get back to the drawing board. When he loses to Jon Jones, look, this is what happened. This is what I got to do. I got to get back to the drawing board. Every fight, he always faces the music. People are talking about Dominic Cruz and how he had that very nice and classy post-fight speech at the press conference when he lost to Cody Garbrandt. But Chael has been doing that a lot. And Chael is really the guy who showed everyone the way, because he talks a big game and he has high expectations, and people want to see him win, but they also want to see him lose just as bad. So when he does suffer a loss, he's got to face the music, and he always does that. So the Chael Sonnen Tito Ortiz fight goes poorly for Chael. There's controversy. There's a lot of crazy stuff that goes on there. Some people say the fight was fixed. Some people say that Chael took a dive. Some people say that him and Tito were in on it. They were in cahoots. I don't know what the deal is, but there's controversy in the fight, and Chael, again, he talked a big game going into the fight, but there he is. He has to answer the music, and he does it with some class, and then he goes on, and now he's on a 2-fight win streak. He goes in there. We finally get the Vanderlei Silva fight. I guess it delivered because we've been waiting for it so long, and the fight was, there was action in the fight. And, these two guys are really not the same that they once were, and so it was as good of a fight that it could possibly be at this point. So I guess the fight delivered. He has this fight against Rampage in the Bellator Heavyweight Grand Prix, and now Chael is 2 fights away from being the Bellator Heavyweight Champion. So the story for Chael Sonnen is not even close to being over. He's still got a lot left in the tank. He's still got a lot of fights left in him. There still are a lot of guys that I would like to see him fight in the tournament and outside of the tournament. There's a lot of fights for him in Bellator. I think there's a lot of fun fights that he can take. There's a lot of fights that he can take in multiple weight classes. So who knows what the future will hold for him. And obviously there's his commentary. He's a very good analyst. He's got his podcast, which is very successful, and he does a great job at that. I know right now I'm rambling, and I know you're probably mad at me, and I know I've gone very, very long. I've gone for almost 2 hours, and I know you're probably upset, and most of you have probably already turned me off, but I had to really tell you the true story about Chael Sonnen and debunk a lot of the things that people get wrong about Chael, or the things that people don't want to tell you about Chael because A, they don't know, or B, they don't want to say because it's not as fun as the other stuff. Now, at the end of all these videos in this new series that I'm doing, at the end of these videos, I'm always going to leave you with a lesson or a moral or a point to the story, and something that you can take with you, something that you can apply to your life, even though you're probably not a fighter, or you probably haven't experienced the same things that Chael Sonnen has experienced in his life and in his career. There's still a lesson that we can learn, and there's still something that we can learn from anyone in any walk of life, and there's still something that we can take from someone's story and apply to our lives. So I could do some sort of lesson that relates to the story I just told you about Chael Sonnen and his career, his rise from unknown contender to one of the biggest draws in the sport and a very well-known fighter. I'm not going to do it. I'll let Chael do it for me, because Chael has taught us many great life lessons over the years. And a lot of these lessons are in the style of the character Chael Sonnen plays. But there are some of these lessons that I'm going to tell you that Chael has given us over the years that are ones that you can really apply to your life. So here it goes. Now to the lessons that Chael Sonnen has given to us over the years. If you're not willing to go too far, you will never go far enough in life. Say what you want before the fight, but when it's done, you accept the result. If you want to be heard, you got to make a little noise. Horses in Brazil and buses in America look alike. Never offer any apologies. The only way to eat a steak is medium rare. The triangle choke is the last refuge of cowards. MMA is not a sport, it's a legal term. Brazilians do not come from a bowing culture. If you bow in Brazil, they'll hit you over the head and steal your wallet out of your pocket. Ed Soares can be replaced by an app that you can download for $9.99 on your iPhone. Respect is a street term for give me your coat and shoes. If you lose, it doesn't mean the other guy is good. It just means you're that bad. The only way a person should leave public office is in handcuffs. Somebody is going to win and somebody is going to lose, but never refuse to participate because you're scared to fail. There's always pressure, and that pressure is earned. They'll tell you failure is not an option. That is ridiculous. Failure is always an option. Failure is the most readily available option at all times. But it's a choice. You can choose to fail or you can choose to succeed. Bad times don't last, bad guys do. If somebody has done something you want to do, all you need to do is go out and copy them. A real man does these three things. He does what he says he's going to do, when he says he will do it, and for the price he says he will do it for. Good things do happen to bad people. A black belt under the Nogueira brothers is like saying I got a free toy in my Happy Meal. And the last lesson Chael taught us, and possibly the most important lesson you will ever learn in this life: never piss off a gangster. Oh yeah, one more thing. Kaboom!